new music, but most likely music you didn't even know existed until now. This piece, Echa, composed by Dr. James Lee III, is one of the thousands of compositions in the African Diaspora Music Database.
You know, it feels like it's always been an uphill climb for composers of color, women, anybody, to break into operas and symphonies in terms of having their music and their stories heard and appreciated.
We'll talk to its creator, Dr. Louise Toppin. And did you know that orchestra leaders all over the country have somehow discovered the music of classical composers of color and have made them part of their seasons?
It's heartening to see not only how many people are using these and other resources, there's a whole bunch of them out there, but then how they're using them and how that translates into programming in the classroom and on the concert hall.
You'll hear from Rob Deemer of the Institute for Composer Diversity. From the Second Street Dreams audio network, this is Classical Music in Color. Music, news, and information about people of color in classical music. I'm Judelyn Gibson. There is something enlightening happening in the world of classical music.
I'm Rob Deemer, head of composition here at the State University of New York at Fredonia and the director of the Institute for Composer Diversity.
Deemer's Institute for Composer Diversity lists the music of hundreds of classical composers of color and women. He's seen increased interest in the site.
I know just from folks that I've been talking to and seeing what we've been getting on the site, you know, things have already picked up in the last month or two in terms of both utilization and folks having questions about, okay, what are the next steps in terms of diversifying repertoire around the country?
Are they searching because they're looking for minority composers of music they've never heard or heard of? Are they saying, well, we're looking at our 2022-23 season? What kinds of questions and activities are going on?
One of the cool things that happened at the end of last year was the Sphinx organization based up in
Detroit
gave the Institute one of their 4 venture fund grants to be able to work on a number of projects, one of which was to increase the number of Black and Latinx composers and their works in our resources, which is awesome, but also to partner with organizations around the country to be able to do that, to help them in diversifying the repertoire. So actually, we don't have official documents signed, so I can't tell you who they are yet, but we're already in the process of working with several, and we're talking about organizations. These range anywhere from orchestras to schools of music at universities to actually school districts in at least 1 or 2 cities, as well as even a radio station out on the West Coast to help them, you know, look at their programming, kind of getting a sense in terms of what they've already been doing, look at their audience and try and get a sense in terms of what might be appropriate for who they're working with, whether or not it's students or audiences. And then not only looking at the resources and looking at who the composers and the works are, but also helping them with their decision-making processes, like looking at their procedures and figuring out what's the best way to make sure that we're going to be working with these folks for the next 2 years as part of the grant. But then after that, how do we make sure that their decision-making processes are such that they're programming more diversely, intentionally, and not accidentally from here on out, and then also providing models so that other groups can do the same.
Are there any particular composers that are at the top of the list?
it's fascinating because whether or not you're talking about high school band or pre-high school choir or professional orchestra, there's some composers that kind of write music across the board, and then there are others that kind of focus on a particular uh you know both genre and level. There are some more composers out there that Anne McGinty is one that pops into my mind, as well as Julie Giroux. Those are two women composers that have made huge inroads in terms of having their works performed across the country with both young bands, young orchestras from elementary school through high school. And then you have composers, say at the professional level, and of course there's so many of them these days. But let's see, just this year alone, one of the names that a lot of folks, especially in the orchestral world, will be hearing a lot from is Jessie Montgomery, because she has not just one but numerous works being performed by orchestras around the country. And I think you're going to be hearing a lot more from her, as well as Missy Mazzoli, and just there's a whole bunch of them, but those are two that pop into my head.
So there's women composers getting some play, African American composers getting some play. It sounds like it's too good to be true.
We have the data now. We're just putting together a report where we looked at 133 orchestras around the country, which is a few more than we did a couple of years ago. And it's great because in addition to looking at all of the season this upcoming year of the 2022, we were actually also able to look back and look at previous years to see what was it like the last year and the year before, and then in 17 and 16 and 15 to kind of see how things have changed. And it's interesting that you bring up the concept of too good to be true. I will tell you that it remains to be seen, but I can tell you, say 5-6 years ago, if you combine all of the works that were performed from about almost 90 orchestras back then, and this is from data that we got from the Baltimore Symphony when they were doing stuff like this, about 5 or 6 years ago, the average, if you combined all of the underrepresented composers, the women composers, composers of color, it was at about 4%, 5%.
And that was all in February and March.
Exactly. It was all, it was very focused, and you just wasn't very much. And that was how many works within the entire season. So if you looked at, if an orchestra did 100 works in a season, they did 4 by both. Like if you add up all the women and all the composers of color, it would be 4. Not a good look. Back in 2019, when I first did this kind of analysis, that jumped up to 12%, which still isn't great, but it's 3 times as much that it had been a few years previous. This year, it's just under 23%.
That's amazing.
So it's doubled just in 2 years. So, and I can tell you that I'm just looking at the numbers right here. 12% was just women, and 17% were composers of color. So there were actually a lot of composers of color that are on this year's orchestral season. So people are going to see a lot more works by not dead white guys this year.
Are you able to talk to them at all and find out what they're thinking, or have they had this huge change of heart? I mean, what's going on with them?
I haven't. We haven't had a chance to be able to actually reach out because, to be honest, we're still aggregating the data and putting, kind of finding, oh, we should look at it like this, and oh, what about that question? But once we do really want to reach out and to find out what the questions have been. I think it's been twofold. It's been it wasn't on their radar for reasons, and obviously there have been people calling for this for a long time, but for whatever reason, I think fear of alienating donors, alienating audiences, there's any number of reasons why orchestras might not have wanted to move away from their traditional canon. But also, obviously, in the last year and a half, we've just seen so much. I think there has been a shift, and we've talked about this before, where society in general has just kind of been like, why can't we change this? And so I think there have been a lot of groups around the country that did say they were going to change. And now it's a matter of figuring out how to be able to make those changes. And I think they are making them. And the numbers bear that out. Now the question is going to be, okay, how can we make sure that it's equitable across the board? You know, if they think, well, there's a lot more composers that we haven't heard of before, what happens the year after that and the year after that? And you're like, nope, this is not even the new normal yet, but it's much closer. And then it's a matter of, okay, well, then how do you do this every year after year after year?
I'm hearing things like Mozart is great, Beethoven is great, and no one is saying that these people are not great. Yep. No one is saying that. But they somehow, some of them are hearing Mozart's not great. You want us to put in this black guy or this woman or this, this Asian or this Hispanic, whatever, in place of Mozart. And that is not at all. It's just been very interesting about the pushback that they're getting. Not even within the organizations, but also from without. You talked about the donors and subscribers. Some of them just can't get it. They can't grasp it at all.
And any kind of change, whenever you try and change something quickly, that can get folks freaked out, and it was probably I remember reading books about conductors where, in the early 70s, if people were playing Stravinsky, it was still like a scandal that they were playing new music, even though it was like 70 years old. But now I think people, for whatever reason, they're using it, this push towards trying to find at least a little bit more of an equitable solution to make sure that when people go to the concert hall, people who are not white, people who are not men, actually get to hear music by people who are like them as a threat. And so, of course, that's what they do. But again, the numbers bear it out. It's still 70% dead white guys, which is great. And I've conducted music by Beethoven and by so many great composers, and that's not what any of these folks are looking at doing, is getting rid of music. And I think people have just gotten into the habit of thinking that new in music is a bad thing, and new doesn't necessarily even mean contemporary. It's just not known. And so that's kind of where all of this tension is, because everyone who teaches music have been just pointing to the traditional masterworks and the traditional master composers. And now this new shift is kind of calling that into question. And so I think it will calm down, I hope, over the next 2 or 3 years, let's say. But I think over time, people will just be like, oh, this is the new normal.
There is also the issue of the pandemic and star performers, violinists, pianists, singers, etc., who have to learn this music that many have never heard of.
I came across recently, what is it, the Anchorage Symphony, and their programming was super diverse. And so I think people are seeing this as like, wait a minute, it's been slowly happening over the last, say, 2 or 3 years, where people are kind of dipping their toe in the water, and they're realizing that, oh, wait, A, we're not scaring off our audiences, and B, we're actually having the potential of actually bringing in new audiences. And so then they're going to get a little bit more comfortable. And as they learn the rep, as the conductors have to learn the rep because they weren't trained in it, as the soloists learn the rep because they haven't learned it, you're going to see more of that. Florence Price is a perfect example. There's a lot of folks who want to play her music, but of course her piano concerto or all of those, her violin concerto, like you literally have to have pianists learn the music in order to be able to schedule that. And then of course, sometimes these things are scheduled a year, 2 years, 3 years in advance. And so my guess is that over time we are seeing, I think the pandemic really had an effect on this. We were able to, you got a bit of a sense that people were able to do a hard reset.
Mm-hmm.
Right,
Yes.
because almost every orchestra had to cancel their seasons last year. So that allowed for them for this year's season to be like, hey, we can actually make a bit of a change in our season that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. It would have been much
Much
slower.
harder, yeah, for
Yeah,
them to.
so they were able to kind of reconfigure their programs on a dime that they wouldn't have normally been able to do had they not had an entire year completely canceled.
Rob Deemer of the Institute for Composer Diversity at the State University of New York at Fredonia. He'd like to believe that this trend will continue for years to come. The African Diaspora Music Database is a lot like the Institute for Composer Diversity, except it covers the world of classical musicians of color.
I'm pushing in my little corner of the world saying, let's get the Black people in there, because that's the largest group that's been writing consistently for the same time. They're not in there.
Right.
But I'm not saying stop there. I'm saying, yeah, Hispanic music needs to be in there, Latino, Latinx. It all needs to be a part of it. So my name is Louise Toppin. It's Dr. Louise Toppin. I'm a professor of voice at the University of Michigan, and I'm the director of Videmus and the George Shirley Vocal Competitions. I'm the founder of the African Diaspora Music Project. It's a project that I've been working on and not even knew that I was working on probably for 20 some years. And it started with me. My dissertation area when I graduated from the University of Michigan with my doctorate was African American music. And it was classical music, because I could see already that people were working on jazz and they were beginning to work on our other music, but nobody was really tackling much this area. And I was very curious about it. I said, if I'm studying classical music, or did Black people write anything that goes along with all this that I'm seeing from the Europeans? And so my first focus was more, people in the 20th century, because they were living. Michigan was a place that happened to bring in quite a few African Americans. So I got to know people like Adolphus Hailstork, who's just turned 80, and some of those guys that, 30 years ago were 50 in the prime of their career. But the more I studied it, the more I began to find there were Black people writing in the 1700s. And so writing and realizing that continuum was not making it into classical music is what started me with my dissertation area. And then when I began collecting this music.
How many pieces of music do you have?
I have several thousand. I mean, we're in the 4,000. This is my personal. We've now done everything that's in my personal library, but that's how many I had collected, from the hundreds or so I started with to the thousands. Now we've also added orchestral.
We're not talking just African Americans?
I either say the diaspora or I say Black, just so we all know that I'm very much talking about all of them. We looked at the other sites to see how we could be different, because we didn't want to duplicate their efforts. They have a specific function in terms of their listings are showing you what's there. Ours are for the people who, okay, now you know what's there, but you want to know, is this song for you specifically? We provide a little bit more texture and information to try to, I know I'm a soprano, so that's all I know. I'm a soprano. I can type in soprano, and the hundreds of songs show up.
Dr. Toppin admits that in the excitement of putting the African Diaspora Music Database together, she forgot to include a tracking device. That means she did not know who or what orchestral groups and or choirs were perusing the site.
the way I know is I got a note recently. Delaware Symphony said, I just wanted to thank you for using your research. I didn't know Delaware Symphony was using it, or Charleston Symphony called me and said, can we have a meeting? We were using your book. I'm like, so I'm finding out a lot of it from that kind of thing, that they're looking for something specific, and then they write and say, I've been using your resource since you released it in April. I very much pray that this is not a moment, but that this really is a movement that is a sustainable movement, and that if we can get through a generation that has been taught this and heard this and participated in ensembles with it, it won't be unusual. We just need to get through a cycle of about 10 years where people who taught differently and thought differently have retired, and those who have embraced a new kind of teaching philosophy. All we need is for them to get in place. This won't go away.
Dr. Louise Toppin of the African Diaspora Music Project. Find the links on the Classical Music and Color page on secondstreetdreams.com. Our coda this month features a job opportunity. Columbia University's music department in New York is looking for an assistant professor with a specialization in music theory and race. They're looking for someone with either a PhD or a DMA. The Color of Music Festival is moving west for the first time ever.
The Color of Music Festival is proud to announce its California debut in the forward-thinking city of Sacramento, California. 2 years in the making, this historic event showcases how leaders of the Golden State and City is setting the pace for others to emulate. Runs November 10th to the 13th. For tickets and additional information, visit us online at colormusic.org.
Deutsche Grammophon has released a new album of music by Florence Price. It's the latest from the Philadelphia Orchestra and its music director, Yannick Nazet-Seguin. They're performing Price's symphonies numbers 1 and 3. It's in celebration of her achievements in surmounting systemic barriers of African Americans and women in classical music. And the Oakland Symphony has held a memorial concert for Michael Morgan. The conductor led the orchestra for 30 years before he died in August of complications from a kidney transplant. The concert can be heard online on Sunday, October 24th on KDFC 90.3 FM in San Francisco. It's at 4 o'clock Pacific Time. You can also access it on oaklandsymphony.org. Check the Classical Music and Color page on secondstreetdreams.com for links. We are still thanking the doctors and nurses and other hospital workers who are still working tirelessly to keep us as healthy as possible despite some of our own efforts. We're also thanking the folks who pick up our trash, deliver our food, the people at the grocery and drugstores, and yes, the police and firefighters too. Stay safe, stay healthy, like your life depends on it, because it does. We are the Second Street Dreams Audio Network, on the radio and on the WWW. Thank you for listening to the October 2021 edition of Classical Music and Color. I'm Julian Gibson.